On a recent cross-country road trip, I came across this poster in a trinket store, a tourist store, and it had the emblem of a gun with a red circle and a hash through it, and it said, "Real men don't use guns." And my initial reaction was, it kind of pissed me off. But then I had to stop and think, well, is that really true? Is it true that a real man would never use a gun? The answer I came away with was no, and that the comment or the thought of that, if not just outright silly, is for sure terribly outdated. And let me explain why. The whole idea of a weapon in general is to defend oneself using a level of force that keeps someone from doing damage to you. The exceptions are those circumstances where there are rules that each combatant or fighter will agree to. In the case of the need for using any weapon, including a gun, to defend yourself, we're talking about the use of deadly force. If it's two men, I'll just say men for now, duking it out, you cannot use deadly force anyway, because once you get to the put them up, both people have now agreed to combat. And when each person agrees to combat, neither can use deadly force during that combat. The only time the force can be escalated is when one of the combatants yields in whatever fashion the yielding would take place. Usually it's, "I give up, man," or usually you're on the ground, okay, you know, and the other person backs away. Then the fight or the combat, the mutually agreed to combat at that point, is over. Now, if you have yielded and the person continues to advance, which means their intent is to inflict more damage, today that's referred to as a beatdown. And if you look at mixed martial arts or any movie, the goal is to continue beating someone while they are on the ground. The days of chivalry in fighting have long been gone. My point is, in this case, is that you are only protected when you use lethal force in your defense or defense of another. If, one, you did not invite it, you did not agree to participate, and it is being inflicted on you or another innocent person. In that case, you can use any force necessary to stop the threat. Now, you need to understand that regardless of what you see on television and movies and what you might hear, being knocked out is this close to being killed. So to say that you should be prepared to accept that kind of damage to yourself, even from one blow, is actually pretty stupid. In the intro photo, you saw the two fists, and each was wrapped. And there is a reason that professional fighters and others wrap their hands. Or if you have a bag that you punch, or you do that at home, or a bob, which is one of those mannequin-looking devices that you can punch or kick on, you will wear gloves. The notion that you're going to stand and bare knuckle intentionally to demonstrate your manhood is really, really silly. Why? Because in this thing called the hand, there are many, many small bones. Most of the time, if you engage in a level of force just using your hands that you believe is going to fend off a threat, you're going to break something in those hands, which will then render one or both of them useful for nothing. So even if you had a weapon that you could go to, you couldn't hold it, and if you broke your trigger finger or anything that controlled small motor skills in a firearm, you can't do that. Fighting with fisticuffs, when you are attacked and you are not agreed to fight, doing that with fisticuffs is just plain stupid. Real men defend themselves, not fight. Almost all male species of mammals that we know engage in ritual combat, usually around mating, but I'll digress a bit. You recognize those in horned animals when they come together and they test each other, sometimes really violent, but their bodies are made for that. And the goal is not to kill the others, because we have a hardwired thing not to kill our own species, including humans, by the way. But the goal is to show dominance. Apes and simians and chimpanzees all do the same thing. With humans, we refer to that as the monkey dance. You will recognize the monkey dance. It's been around forever. Again, the two males are not engaging in combat to kill the other. They are trying to demonstrate dominance to the target and to observers. People don't do the monkey dance unless there are observers. It will look something like this. Why are you looking at me? Why are you looking at my woman? You're in my seat, get up. What are you looking at? Kind of comments. All intended to trigger a response from the other person that escalates into the chest bumping, fist throwing thing. To support the myth, real men don't use guns. Well, remember, if you engage in that, you are now a voluntary participant in mutual combat. And you cannot defend yourself with deadly force until one or the other has indicated that they are yielding. Right? And you, if you're the victim, pretty much know when it's time to give up. And you cannot go to a deadly weapon, whether it's a firearm or a knife or a bludgeon or anything else, until you have indicated you're withdrawing. That's important, right? The real message here is that a real man doesn't fight. A real man avoids the combat. A real man will defend himself and a loved one or others against an attack or an advance who has chosen not to stop. The advancing person, when you have indicated you are not going to fight, you are not going to participate, and you are withdrawing, even though you don't necessarily have to do that. In some places, stand your ground laws provide that safety for you. But just common wisdom would say, if you can withdraw safely and just leave the place, then you will not be involved in a fight unless the person continues to pursue. Pursue meaning to close on you. And your goal is to stop the threat. That person is threatening to do bodily harm, serious bodily harm, or they wouldn't keep coming. Now you can use whatever force necessary to stop that threat, up to and including deadly force with whatever tool you have available. And if that means, and you're in a place where you can carry a firearm and you are legal to carry a firearm, you can use that. The message there is real men do use guns. Another part of understanding this is the notion of disparity of force. This thinking that somehow there is an equal match of combatants. Remember, combatants are doing this by agreement. And that's almost never true, especially when the monkey dance is involved, or when there is a violent attack by surprise. You, as the victim then, are either outnumbered or overpowered, because that's what the predator is trying to do, right? If a person is a bully, or a person wants to inflict their power over you, and they want to do that physically, then you have to be able to defend yourself against that kind of threat. Remember, turning and engaging in a combat situation, fisticuffs, is you are agreeing to a fight, which means you just eliminated your right to use deadly force until you withdraw. The point is, if you don't engage, you don't have to withdraw. You see what I'm getting at? Rarely does a person who wants to fight someone pick on someone their own size. Remember that way back? Pick on somebody your own size. Folks don't do that anymore. They attack who they choose to attack, and they attack who they feel they will walk away safely. So the ability to use whatever tool necessary to defend yourself is also defending yourself against disparate force. Now, in most places in this country, any man who attacks a woman, with a weapon or not, in almost every case, if the woman kills him, that's justified during that attack if, one, she didn't participate in it, so it's not a domestic violence thing, and both of them are agreed to combat, which tends to happen. But she was attacked by a person, she didn't ask for it, wasn't expecting it, and the person chose not to withdraw after she's given the indication, then she can almost always be justified in using deadly force to stop a threat from a male. It's not always that easy, male on male, which is why you have to really pay attention to whether or not you are agreeing to participate in the conflict. There is a view, usually held by mothers and wives and girlfriends of some men, and even some men, who believe that having a tool that allows you to administer deadly force is a bad thing. But if I spend 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the martial arts using hands, whether it's Kung Fu or Taekwondo or whatever the flavor of the year is, and if I get good enough with that, I can then defend myself and ward off a threat. Unwise. Couple of reasons. Those are sports, not self-defense in a sense where you are actually going to ward off or use enough force to keep a threat away from you. You must be in close quarter combat for those techniques to work. And frankly, if you're that close, you've done something wrong. Why? If you're that close, you have engaged in the monkey dance. What that means is that you have allowed a potential threat to get too close to you. Now, you can use certain open hand techniques, but they are techniques designed to give you distance and space to allow you to withdraw from the threat, to then go to a secondary tool now that you have the distance. A knife, for example, might work, but you have to get back into close quarters to make that effective. The goal is to withdraw and give yourself distance. You don't need 5, 10, 15, 20 years to figure that out. You're also not going to spend that time trying to disarm somebody with a knife or disarm somebody with a gun with your hands. That's just nuts. And I know there are folks that do that. If you're a law enforcement person, or if you work in a prison, or if you work in some place where it's a high threat, in some cases if you're a military person and you're special ops and you're trained to do highly deadly open hand, closed hand type techniques, then fine. But that's not the average citizen. And the average citizen does not have a duty to run to gunfire, does not have a duty to go and intervene physically. They may, but they don't have a duty to do that. At best, your duty is to be a good witness. Sounds kind of cold-blooded, but you do have a choice. Do you want to go and intervene in a fight where there are two weapons, two guys with knives? Or do you want to be on 911 and say there's a fight going on, two guys with knives, whatever? If you're trained in first aid, you may want to be ready to render that first aid. If you have the ability to use deadly force to stop deadly force being used on another, you had better know with certainty which party is wrong. It's unlikely. So to say that if I start my child off at 5 and they go the rest of their lives and they're learning all this martial arts stuff, all that means is that they have learned the rules for agreed to combat. If you engage in agreed to combat, you may not ever use deadly force unless you withdraw from that agreed to combat. And we talked about that before. How do you withdraw? You yield, you verbally say, I've had enough, you tap out, whatever the current rules are. If you're attacked by a criminal, they're not going to listen to any of that stuff, and you have almost no time once it gets that close. So would a real man enter into physical combat, or would they use the best equalizer ever made, and that's a firearm, to eliminate or stop the threat? There is no sane requirement for a man to engage as a civilian when attacked or when threatened by a person who continues to advance on you with the intent of inflicting serious bodily injury, harm, or death, and you cannot avoid it. It's stupid to say that man, in order to prove himself a man, must use the least effective tool, his hands, to deal with that threat. That's just nuts. So, do real men use guns? Absolutely. Do real men agree to street-based combat? Absolutely not. The rule is, don't start nothing, won't be nothing. Why? Because our brains are ruckus.